check it out. I don't know if you can see this or not, but I am wearing my favorite kitty pants. So yesterday when we stopped, that leads me way back too far. Let's try this. Yesterday when we stopped, George was getting ready to head to where? Does anybody remember? I think it was the Ohio Valley. Sounds about right. The governor had told him that it was going to be a dangerous mission. So today we're going to start with chapter 4. It's called A Wilderness Journey. Sounds interesting. Deep in the Ohio wilderness, George Washington's small party encountered many dangers. Hostile Indians surrounded and threatened them. Despite their compasses, which gave them a sense of direction, they lost their way on more than one occasion. There were no maps to guide them. The winter weather was so severe that streams froze and made drinking water difficult to find. Here's an illustration of them going through the frozen areas. George Washington's greatest challenge on this dangerous journey was to cross the icy Allegheny River safely. The party was on the last leg of its mission. They had reached a point on the Allegheny River where the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is now located. George Washington, the young volunteer, and Christopher Gist, a veteran frontiersman twice his age, left the other members of the expedition and the slow-moving pack horses and went on ahead to search for a place to cross the river. Large chunks of ice dotted the river, and the water flowed very swiftly. Chopping down trees with a single small hatchet, George Washington and Christopher Gist fashioned logs into a raft. It was sundown when they climbed onto their freshly made transport. "We'll never make it," Gist groaned as the dark, violent currents of the river smashed against the raft. "We're sure to capsize." "Hold on and pray," George shouted, trying to make himself heard above the roaring waters. Using every ounce of his great strength, George Washington shoved his pole straight down into the bottom of the raft, hoping to steady it until an opening appeared in the thundering stream of icy water. But the river was much too powerful, even for a giant of a man like Washington. The raft spun in a circle out of control and pitched him head first into the freezing current. "Oh no!" Gist screamed in horror as the raft hurtled on downstream. Then George's long arm shot up above the water and his hand grasped a protruding log. He barely managed to drag himself back onto the raft. But the two men were utterly stranded in the middle of the raging river. The temperature was well below freezing, and suddenly George was soaked to the bone. In the distance, he spotted a little island. "Try to pole the raft over there," he told Gist. "At least it's a spot of dry land." "I don't know if I can make it," Gist gasped. He was still paralyzed with fright at Washington's near drowning, and his own fingers were frostbitten. Somehow they finally reached the island, and the two men stumbled ashore. "This place is completely barren. There's not even a tree to chop down for firewood," George said in dismay. "We must keep walking back and forth to avoid freezing to death," his comrade answered. The night was frigid, but the dawn brought hope. "Look at the river, Chris," George shouted joyously. "It's completely frozen. We don't need the raft anymore. We can just walk across." When they reached the other side, the two men slumped down on the frozen ground. George sat at the foot of a tree to recover from his exhaustion. A group of French soldiers passed by. Without revealing his identity or his reason for being in the wilderness, George Washington engaged them in conversation. Soon the French began drinking wine and offered some to the strangers. Washington and Gist drank only enough to be polite, and then waited until the French became thoroughly drunk and began chattering about their troop movements and plans. They told me it was their absolute design to take possession of the Ohio Valley, and by God, they would do it, George later wrote in his journal. After the French soldiers moved on, Washington and Gist encountered a Native American chieftain named Half King. Gist, who knew how to communicate with Native Americans, explained their mission, and George drew upon his previous experience with them to make Half King feel at ease. "Follow me," the chieftain motioned to the two. Then he summoned his braves, and together they led the white men along hidden trails until they came to some log cabins surrounded by a heavy wooden fence. "This is the French fort," Half King whispered. The French commander, a dignified-looking elderly gentleman, received Washington, but steadfastly refused his demands. "This land belongs to us, not to the English," he insisted. Although the Frenchman stood firm, Half King admired George Washington's courage in confronting him. In fact, he was so impressed with the young Virginian that he adopted him into his Seneca tribe. He gave him the name Conoticarius, which means devourer of villages. George was very flattered because his great-grandfather had acquired the same name during his skirmishes with the Native Americans during the 17th century. George returned safely from his mission, but was unable to bring Governor Dinwiddie any good news. The French would not heed the warning, he told him. They and their Indian allies are prepared for war to capture the Ohio Valley. We shall have to fight. Governor Dinwiddie praised George for having volunteered and undertaken the dangerous journey. He promoted him to the rank of lieutenant colonel, put several hundred soldiers under his command, and sent him back to the wilderness to defend the American settlers and their families from the French and Indian attacks. It was 1754 when 22-year-old George Washington, fearless as ever, led the troops from colonial Virginia into the Ohio wilderness. His first engagement with the enemy resulted in an easy victory. The Indian scouts that he had recruited spotted a patrol of sleeping French soldiers. Washington ordered his soldiers quietly to surround the group, and he strode into the clearing and called for the enemy to surrender. Look at this. Arising hastily, the French fired a hail of bullets at the Virginians, who quickly returned the fire. In less than 15 minutes, the encounter ended. Of the 32 Frenchmen, 10 lay dead, and the survivors surrendered to young George Washington. Flushed with this early victory, Washington jotted down a note to be delivered to Governor Dinwiddie upon his return. "If the whole detachment of the French behave with no more resolution than this party did," he wrote, "I flatter myself to say we shall have no great trouble in driving them to Montreal." Before long, Washington realized, however, that forcing the French back toward Canada would be a much more difficult task than he had imagined. Washington and his men built a stockade, which they named Fort Necessity, in a meadow surrounded by high mountains. Washington intended to follow the British military strategy by engaging the French and Indians in combat on the open field. But the enemy opened fire from the mountains and forced Washington and his soldiers to abandon the fort and fight in the open field. There they were sitting ducks for trained French marksmen who fired from hiding places in the thick forest. To make matters worse, a rainstorm soaked the Virginians' gunpowder, ruined the operating mechanisms on their guns, and left the troops standing waist-deep in muddy water. When the fighting ended, almost one-third of Washington's 284-man force were dead or wounded. At midnight, Washington and the French commander sat down together. The Frenchmen promised not to attack the survivors if Washington agreed to their immediate retreat back to Virginia. Washington hated the thought of defeat and surrender, but he had no choice but to accept the French offer. His men had few functioning weapons, and morale was terrible. With a deep feeling of discouragement, Washington and his battered forces straggled back home, carrying the wounded on their backs. For weeks after this devastating defeat, Washington was in a black mood. He lashed out at anyone who dared to criticize his performance. But he had to cheer up for the sake of the men under his leadership. "Do not despair," Washington told his troops. "We shall return to the battlefield and do better. The King of England is sending one of his best commanders, Major General Edward Braddock, and 1,300 troops to help us defeat the French and Indians. If only I can convince the general that a new type of strategy is necessary." General Braddock offered George Washington the position of aide-de-camp, or aide-de-camp, if we wanted to say it all the way, a sort of special assistant. But on the eve of their departure, Mary Washington arrived. She was in a very emotional state. "Why must you risk your life again in a military adventure?" she demanded, half in anger, half in fear. "Haven't you done enough already? Really, Mother, have you no faith that God will protect me?" "Never mind that," she snapped. "Who'll take care of Ferry Farm while you're gone?" "I'm quite sure that you can keep the slaves and servants in order," he replied with a grin. Indeed, no one on the farm would dare cross this formidable mistress. No sooner did Washington arrive with General Braddock's forces on the frontier than his mother sent him an urgent message. "I really must have someone, a Dutchman perhaps, to manage this farm," she wrote, "and please fetch me a tub of butter at once." "Honored Madam," George wrote back in a sarcastic letter, "I do hope you realize that I am far from civilization and find it impossible to fulfill your requests. Sincerely, your son." General Braddock proved almost as hard to deal with as Washington's mother. He would not heed George's warning to conceal his men in well-protected hiding places, rather than deploy them in the full sight of the enemy. "You will endanger all of our lives if you don't adjust your battle plan," Washington declared. "What right have you, a young man who hasn't even grown a beard, to give me lectures?" the general shouted back. Here's an illustration of George talking to the general. Indeed, General Braddock could not explain to himself why he tolerated Washington's advice. Perhaps he admired him for his pluck and courage, lack of beard notwithstanding. The general readily disciplined any of his men who got out of line, but his attitude toward Washington was different. Nevertheless, he drew the line at accepting changes to his military strategy. In preparation for the battle, the British Redcoats, so called because of the color of their uniforms, marched straight in a line onto the field where they were painfully vulnerable to the French and Indian fighters hiding in the dense forest. "Tell your men to spread out and hide," Washington urged Braddock yet again. "The way they're marching now, they're easy targets for the enemy." "I know what I'm doing," the general snapped in reply. Sure enough, the French and Indians staged an ambush that killed hundreds of Braddock's troops. This is the fault of the American colonial leaders. They didn't give us enough supplies and provisions. General Braddock cursed. These were his last words. For the next moment he fell, mortally wounded from an enemy bullet. His army began to retreat in total disorder. They ran like sheep being chased by wolves, Washington later wrote in his journal. Washington, in his typical manner, took charge, trying to rally the panic-stricken troops while dodging bullets. 2 horses were shot out from under him, and 4 bullets passed through his battle jacket. Fortunately, he was not injured. This experience proved to be a significant moment in George Washington's life. His admiration for England's military prowess suddenly disappeared. Dressed in his blue uniform and cocked blue hat, Washington felt completely separate and distinct from the English redcoats. He felt, instead, like an American. Perhaps at this moment, George Washington saw for the first time the necessity of liberating the American colonies from their English motherland. Before this, George and all the people he knew considered themselves loyal citizens of the British Crown. The laws they followed were British laws, and the British Army provided them with their protection. But although they dressed and thought and spoke like Englishmen, the colonists were different. Their rich, unexplored land was a very different place than was Old England, which George and many colonists had never even seen. How soon would the differences outweigh the similarities, and which would finally win out? Americans were just starting to ask questions like these, and no one would play a greater part in providing the ultimate answer than young George Washington himself. That's the end of chapter 4. Tomorrow we're going to read chapter 5, which is called George's First Command. I've lost my bookmark, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.